left. Recording just notified. So really we want to work through some of the basics, I guess, the foundations of the climate change challenge. So Lesley Hughes, who's joined us tonight, is a climate scientist and will walk us through some of the challenges so far with climate action and where we're actually at. And we also want to talk through, I guess, the economic implications of climate inaction and also climate action. And Tim Buckley will share some background information on that. And then also talk through what's possible, what could the future look like. And Gabrielle Kuiper will jump in to talk through that for us. And then we'll spend the last half hour running through some of Nicolette's priorities in this space. And then there will be a panel Q&A at the end. So throughout the call, please put your questions in the chat. For those of you that are less familiar with Zoom, if you get your mouse cursor up and hover it towards the top of your Zoom screen, you will see a bunch of boxes pop up, and there's one that's a little speech bubble that is the chat, and you can enter your questions in there. We'll hold them all over until we get into that Q&A session. I briefly mentioned the people that are joining us today on the panel. I gave you a little bit of background on Lesley. Tim, I didn't mention, was the director of the Climate Energy, is the director of Climate Energy Finance and was formerly an MD at Citigroup. And also Gabrielle, who's a member of AEMC's Reliability Panel, a senior advisor to the Smart Energy Council, and an expert in distributed energy resources more broadly. Finally, I guess also the key person that I haven't provided the background on that is very relevant to this area is Nicolette. So obviously the community independent for Bradfield, but also up until very recently was an executive at the Responsible Investment Association of Australasia, the investor group on climate change, and helped establish the Clean Energy Finance Corporation. So deep and strong background in this field. So without further ado, I might just hand over to Lesley to provide us with a bit more of a background on the problem we have with climate change as it stands, and I guess why we've gotten to where we've gotten to. So over to you, Lesley.
Thanks very much, Ed. Good evening, everybody. And I'm coming to you from the land of the Wallumattagal people of the Darug Nation. Well, the world has now warmed 1.2 degrees above pre-industrial levels. And along with that warming, we've seen an increase in the severity and the frequency of extreme events, be they bushfires, floods, droughts, heat waves. They're all becoming more severe and more frequent. And here in Australia, of course, with the Black Summer bushfires and the recent floods, which look like they might be ongoing in northern New South Wales, many of us have experienced those extremes firsthand and are still doing so. The Paris Climate Agreement is a really important international framework to cut emissions and to keep warming, preferably, well, definitely to below 2 degrees and preferably to below 1.5 degrees. The pledges that the global nations made to the Paris Climate Agreement, if met 100% and on time, unfortunately, still would get us to 2.7 to 3 degrees. There were higher ambitions of emissions reduction cuts at the Glasgow COP last year, but even if those ambitious emission targets were met 100% and on time, we will still get to 2.4 degrees. So that is twice the global average of warming that we currently have. And Australia, of course, has warmed more than the global average. In 2019, we had already warmed more than 1.4 degrees. So what do we need to do? We need to halve global emissions by 2030. It's what we do this decade that counts. Globally, we must be at net zero by 2040. If we wait till 2050, that is now a decade too late. Unfortunately, the emissions that are already in the atmosphere will get us to over 1.5 degrees now. We've waited too long to get emissions under control. So what we've got to do is work very hard to stay below 2 degrees and to bring those temperatures back down below 1.5. If we don't do that, we're basically not providing a safe climate for our children. Any new development of fossil fuel, be that coal, oil or gas, is incompatible with both the Paris climate targets and with a safe climate for us and our children and our grandchildren and beyond. So some of the things we need to do is stop using taxpayers' money to fund fossil fuel projects and prop up the industry. At the moment, there are over 100 fossil fuel projects in development in Australia. A gas-led recovery is a complete oxymoron. Gas is a hugely important fossil fuel and contributor to climate change. So we have to acknowledge that we are a huge part of the problem here in Australia. We're not just burning stuff at home, we're digging it up and shipping it over the seas. We're one of the world's largest exporters of fossil fuel. We are a big part of the problem and we have to be a big part of the solution. And my colleagues will be telling you how much we will be. So my final message is we do have a climate emergency on our hands. It's much more than a slogan, it's the reality. We are seeing our physical and our biological world transforming before our very eyes. Just this week, for example, we got word that there is a 4th massive coral bleaching event on the Great Barrier Reef. That's the 4th one in the past 6.5 years. So we're a huge part of the problem. We don't have much time to fix it. Every fraction of a degree of warming matters because every fraction of a degree of warming is doing us harm. Every year matters and every choice matters. And I'll leave it there. Thanks, Ed.
Thank you, Lesley. That was, I was going to say brilliant, but that's not quite the right word. That was eye-opening. Tim, I'd like to pass to you now. Can you shed a bit more light on, I guess, the costs of inaction? Why is inaction actually, like, why are we not taking action? And what do you see the opportunity as being if we do change our ways and make strides in this area?
Certainly. Thanks, Ed, and good evening to everyone. I would also like to start by acknowledging I'm coming to you from the Gadigal lands of the Eora Nation. As Ed mentioned, I'm going to outline the cost of climate science in action and why this is happening in our country, but then finish on a much more positive note, which is outlining some of the enormous opportunities in terms of investment, employment and export growth from embracing the global energy transition in Australia. So whilst climate science denialism is most evident in our federal government, even the state levels are showing serious conflicts of interest. The New South Wales government gets billions of dollars in thermal coal royalties annually. Queensland gets billions of dollars of coking coal royalties. So there is a straight economic incentive to deny the science and delay action. The economic costs of inaction on the climate science logically are going to continue to rise rapidly, as Lesley just detailed, in the absence of preparation. And a very detailed recent Climate Council report said that weather events could potentially cost upwards of $100 billion annually for Australia by the end of this century. So the cost of inaction is in evidence in the lack of planning and preparedness for the severity of extreme weather events. And that was probably most recently seen very, very clearly in the recent flooding. And yet it was only last week that the new New South Wales Planning Minister, Anthony Roberts, revoked a ministerial directive by his predecessor outlining 9 principles of sustainable development. In other words, a requirement to consider the risks of floods and fires before building new homes in New South Wales. So it is just bizarre that the Anthony Roberts would do that while the state is still reeling from the deadly environmental disasters that just hit last month. So Roberts argues that taking climate change into account would restrict the supply of new houses in New South Wales. Bizarrely short-sighted and negligent in my view. So there is a political assumption that Australia can be a free rider in global efforts to deal with climate change. And the federal government has tried to falsify the data and pretend Australia is meeting its emissions reduction commitments, but then also immediately flies the red herring that it doesn't matter what Australia does, we should look at China. Denying responsibility is entirely misleading. Australia is the world's third largest exporter of fossil fuels. We have a huge global role. So the Morrison government argues that exported emissions don't count. I would say that's naive and complicit. The EU emissions trading scheme is one barometer I look at for global momentum, and it's gone from strength to strength in the last 2 years. It's risen fourfold in the last year alone to 80 euros per tonne. So the pricing of carbon emissions in Europe is now accepted by European industry, and having accepted it, they're now working to make sure that that cost is shared by all, so they're not at a competitive disadvantage. So I think you'll hear a lot more over the next year or two about the EU's proposed carbon border adjustment mechanism. But climate action, I think, in Australia will be directly felt by the fact that our key trading partners have pledged rapid emissions reduction targets this decade. Japan down 46%, Korea down 40%, and China to peak emissions before 2030. Now, if they are to deliver on those commitments, that will have absolutely profound impacts on Australian fossil fuel exports. Now, it directly impacts our energy exports, methane gas or LNG as it's called, thermal coal, but also the steel industry. And it's worth bearing in mind, Australia has a world-leading iron ore and coking coal export industries. And so our two biggest exports are impacted as the world's steel industry decarbonises. And China, Korea and Japan will play a key role in that. So over half of Australia's exports are materially exposed in the energy transition. There was a very strong report by Accenture that highlighted the economic complexity of Australia's export profile, and it highlighted that our economic complexity has actually materially dropped in the last 2 decades. And we've been overtaken by countries like India that have built massive global IT expertise. So what am I getting at here? Australia has migrated from riding on the sheep's back to really now just being the quarry to China, Korea and Japan. And we've got to recognise that is a profound risk for our economy. But where there's risk, there's also enormous opportunity. So I just wanted to finish with a couple of key examples of that. Last month saw New South Wales complete expressions of interest requests by the New South Wales Hunter Central Coast Renewable Energy Zone. New South Wales Energy Minister Matt Keane received over $100 billion of private investor interest, a record high level of investor interest, desperate to invest in the decarbonisation of New South Wales. Now, that led Ian Macfarlane, the CEO of the Queensland Resources Council, to declare that coal power in Australia is likely to be gone as soon as a decade from now. Angus Taylor is claiming that this decarbonisation process can be dragged out for 3 decades, but the most senior coal industry lobbyist in Australia acknowledges that that is simply deluded. The decision by Origin Energy's CEO, Frank Calabria, should be shouted out as well. Frank announced last month that he would close Australia's largest coal power plant at Eraring by 2025, 7 years ahead of schedule. And that announcement was reached in agreement with the New South Wales government. And only today, New South Wales Matt Keane announced he'd received private sector plans to develop up to 5,900 megawatts of new electrolyser capacity across New South Wales, 8 times the government's ambitious 700 megawatt target. That is a huge positive from private investors in Australia and globally. Australia has some of the best wind and solar resources in the world, a sparsely populated and enormous continent that is really ideal for renewable energy. But if we pivot back to mining, we constantly hear from the LNP that coal workers are by far the most important people in Australia. What really annoys me about that is that we never hear that Australia is blessed as one of the top 4 nations on this planet in terms of those metals essential for the energy transition. Lithium, iron, bauxite, alumina, zinc, and rare earths. Just take lithium. The price of lithium has risen 15-fold in a year, and demand is booming for electric vehicles and batteries. You'll hear more on that in a minute from Dr. Gabrielle Kuiper. But have you ever heard our Resources Minister, Keith Pitt, actually talk about how Australia is actually producing 49% of the world's lithium? We are an absolute world leader, yet we never hear our federal government talk about that. Whereas 2 years ago, Rio Tinto wanted to shut their zero emissions aluminium refinery in Bell Bay, last month they announced that they not only want to extend the life of it by a decade, they even want to consider expanding output. They're making so much money in zero emissions aluminium in Tasmania. And you might have heard that Korea Zinc's operation in Townsville aims to be 100% green zinc as soon as 2025, a global energy transition leader. That's Australia, okay? Korean investment, but in Australia at Townsville. So the climate crisis is real and it's here now. There will be a cost to Australia, but the investment, employment and export opportunities are huge. Australia can transform from being China's quarry to being a value-added refiner of zero emissions minerals before we export them, and a key beneficiary of the global energy transition. Thank you.
Tim, thank you so much. That was really enlightening and a little bit more encouraging, I suppose, as well, particularly the last few minutes there. Gabrielle, I'd love to turn to you now. One of the common things we hear about the energy transition is that there will still be a requirement for baseload power to be provided by fossil fuels. You know, when the sun doesn't shine and the wind's not blowing, what are we going to do for power then? I'd love to hear from you about your experience in this space and what a different renewable energy system may look like.
Thanks, Ed. We're all breaking the cardinal rules of storytelling tonight by throwing lots of numbers at you. I was listening to a podcast from Margaret Atwood yesterday, and she said no one ever developed a story about the number 9. And apologies, but I'm going to throw a lot more, probably 9 numbers at you in 9 minutes. The best answer, I think, Ed, to that question about baseload is to look at the case study of South Australia. So 15 years ago, South Australia had no large-scale renewables, no wind or no solar, and it went from 0 to 60% renewables in 14 years. So there's now no coal-fired generation operating in the state of South Australia. So anywhere in the world, they're one of the largest jurisdictions operating with such a high proportion of what's known as variable renewable energy. So obviously there are places with lots more hydro, but in terms of having large scale wind and solar, and of course a huge amount of rooftop solar as well. And the other next number I'm going to throw at you, number 2, is AEMO. That's the Australian Energy Market Operator. They operate the system on a day-to-day basis and on a 5-minute basis. Their CEO has said that by 2025, in 3 years' time, they'll be able to manage the system with 100% renewables for any 5-minute period. It's sort of known as instantaneous renewable penetration. And of course, as soon as you can manage the system with these variable renewables for 5 minutes, then you'll be able to manage it once you expand your technological capabilities for 5 hours and then 5 days. And from there, you can obviously expand to managing it for a whole year. It does require a lot of changes to systems. It requires some new technology, things called grid forming inverters, for example. But my favorite analogy, which doesn't come from me, but a systems engineer described the system we've got at the moment with large coal and gas-fired power stations. You've got big rotating spinning turbines, and it's kind of like trying to drive a semi-trailer down a winding road as demand changes. When we get wind and solar into the system with basically power electronics and smart technology and artificial intelligence, that's more like driving an electric motorbike down those curving roads. So it'll actually be easier to operate in a lot of ways. Next number I wanted to throw at you is that once we get to 100% renewables, we can get to 500% renewables, which in fact has been the aspirational target for South Australia. So that's when you get into exporting our renewables in the form of all of the materials that Tim talked about, and also hydrogen, and also you get to electrifying vehicles. So Tim said I'd talk about electric vehicles, which is one of my favourite topics. In terms of the investment that is coming and the way in which we can leverage consumers' investment to make the system better. If we electrify half of our vehicle fleet in the next 10 years, say 7 million vehicles, average cost $20,000 for a new car, hopefully with some federal government subsidies, then that's $140 billion alone. Now, obviously, ideally, we make some of those EVs in Australia and have some more manufacturing jobs. And in fact, people probably know the New South Wales government has committed to have a full electric bus fleet, and they're in fact building electric buses in Western Sydney at the moment, and some of them are already on the roads, apparently lower cost and better quality than they could import from overseas. So I really want to focus on what's known as distributed energy resources or consumer energy resources, and what they can do to help us get faster, cheaper decarbonisation. Those of you who've got solar panels on your roofs, and I'm pretty sure there'll be quite a few of you here this evening, you'll know that solar panels and solar systems have had have a very small payback period. It's down to 3 or 4 years. Obviously, this is still a cost, regardless of whether or not you get finance and or pay for it up front. If you think of, we've got 3 million homes across Australia that have put solar on their roofs. So that's, you know, conservatively a $15 billion investment. We're getting those EVs. Hopefully we'll support through government funding low-income households to electrify, to get off gas. That's a really important part of the story that we haven't touched on. We've talked about stopping gas and coal development, but we also obviously need, particularly to support low-income households to get off gas, because at the moment they're paying 2 standing supply charges. They're paying for electricity to get to their home and gas to get to their homes. And the gas that gets to their homes is actually unsafe. There's a whole lot of health impacts from having gas running into your home. Then we obviously need to make all of our homes far more efficient. And I was at a workshop this morning where someone talked about the German program to create efficient houses, which I hadn't heard about, through KfW, their sort of investment bank, their public investment bank, and equivalent to our Clean Energy Finance Corporation, I guess, in this regard. And they're looking at upgrades to housing through loans, say the equivalent of $50,000, and they're looking at that creating a 260 billion euro program. And obviously the job creation potential of that is enormous. And obviously with better quality homes, you also get better health outcomes. So why am I talking about all these bits and pieces of what we know as behind the meter technology? Well, there's now software whereby aggregation businesses can take all of those behind the meter resources. So say your solar panel is powering your EV and your EV's feeding back into your grid, and maybe your air conditioner's got some switching on it so it can be turned off and on manually or by remote control. And you can aggregate these into what's called a virtual power plant. So I have just written a report on this if anyone's interested. And previously people have sort of said, oh, that's a nice idea. And I looked at it and I said, well, the margins are quite thin at the moment for doing that. But as the capacity, particularly of our batteries, increases, because we're all going to buy batteries on wheels and you get a free car at the same time, then we will have more of these resources to aggregate, and we'll also look at having those resources playing essentially in more energy markets. So that's the future. I finished my analysis, and then at the same time Origin announced that they were closing the Eraring coal-fired power station 7 years early. one of the things that they announced that they were going to do to create more capacity to substitute for the closure of Eraring was to grow their own in-house virtual power plant, all of the behind the meter resources of their customers that they have access to, from what's now 205 megawatts, relatively small, you know, generator in the scheme of things. In 4 years, they're going to get that to 2 gigawatts. So that's 2,000 megawatts. So the same size as the Liddell coal-fired power station that's about to close. And they will, for example, have 5,000 electric vehicles under management. So yes, we need to build more transmission lines. We need lots more large-scale renewables, but we can also do an enormous amount very quickly by all of the consumers buying all of these devices and then those being leveraged to create these virtual power plants. So I'd say we need those. We need microgrids and standalone power systems in remote and regional areas, particularly to make them more resilient to all the climate-related events that Lesley talked about. Then we need the large-scale renewables as well, and we need all of the clean industrial development that Tim talked about.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Gabrielle. And there were a couple of questions that came through in the chat that I think have been directly answered by Tim, though they were directed to you just around how much of South Australia's electricity currently comes from gas. But I think that's all been addressed. And so for people on the call, I'd encourage you to look in the chat. There's a few links in there that people have provided to help you see where electricity is sourced at any point of the day. And also Tim has promoted the IEFA virtual power plants of the future of electricity article as well. So team, we might now shift to Nicoleette's positions in this important space. And so whilst Nicolette is coming on, I might just start sharing screen again, if I can, which I'm struggling to do. There we go. There we go. And so, Nicolette, are you available? Are you off mute?
Yes.
Excellent.
Yes,
over to you.
thank you. Thanks, Ed, and thanks, Gabrielle and Tim and Lesley as well. Thank you. It always reminds me of just how fantastically there's no downside to acting urgently in an orderly fashion, but with not incremental steps on some of these things, it's actually more beneficial to leap change some of these things because it's just fiscally more responsible to do so. It's very exciting. Okay, so before I launch into my priorities around climate action though, I want to just cover this matter off as I did last week in the topic around aged care. It's a question I get asked quite frequently, which is people on the street say, like, I know what the parties stand for, but you're standing as a community independent. So what are your policies and how will you form positions on key issues? So look, I've got a background in policy and I know that it's more than what goes on a slide. It's really thorough research around the issues. There's analysis, there's a disclosure around assumptions of the data, there's the impact recommendations and all those types of things. So tonight, you're not going to get from me my policies. What you will get though is my positions on the priorities I think are necessary to break the deadlock that the parties have had on climate action. But this schematic that you're looking at here is really just shows that once elected into the 47th Parliament, this is what I'm looking to do. I want to research, listen and prepare with expert advice. There's some sources you can see there. I want to present and that advice to the community in a number of ways here in Bradfield. And as you well know, we have such a blessing of very, very qualified and experienced people, and particularly in finance and clean energy as well here. So I'd like your local views. And then all that gets rolled up into an assessment through debate with others in the Parliament as well, and decide on a position mindful of the context in terms of national interest and this amazing thing I call common sense, which I'd like to see a little more of in politics. So on to the next slide. Thank you very much, Ed. So, okay, to my position on climate action. So after passing a federal ICAC, we need to move to passing the federal member for Warringah's climate action bills. That's Ali Stegel. And this is step one. By doing so, we're going to include legislate some targets, which can be a bit risky, but I feel like we just need to draw a line in the sand and move. There'll be emission budget, sector-specific planning, and a whole lot of instruments which will require disclosures around data and broad consultation. So the bills basically create a policy framework necessary for transitioning our economy. It's going to give business the policy certainty that it needs and the transparency for the whole country about the decisions that are being made. It's based principally on the UK model, and I note also that New Zealand is implementing something quite similar in this range, in this framework that the member for Warringah has put forward. So the main elements of the bill are firstly, really quickly, guiding principles, and I just want to share these with you because I think they're really useful. These are effective, efficient and equitable action, informed decision-making, risk-based, integrated decision-making, fiscal responsibility, fair employment transition, community engagement and self-determination, and national and international cooperation. Those principles form the basis that anchor the decisions when this framework is being implemented, when decisions are being made in and around the elements of this framework. Those guiding principles remain, if you like, the sort of, you know, the North Star in a way. Do we have a North Star in the Southern Hemisphere? I think I might have to get a new analogy. So the other elements of the framework, the National Climate Change Risk Assessment, an adaptation plan, emission reduction target that's near term, and then the bit that I think is absolutely critical is the setting of emissions budgets. And that's done through the establishment of a Climate Change Commission. It's given the job, it's separate to government, and it's given the job for recommending the rolling 5-year reduction targets. It has to be an independent body because it leaves the responsibility for policy recommendations based on, it depoliticizes essentially the data that will underpin those recommendations around the 5-year rolling targets. And that's really been, frankly, what has created such a roadblock from the parties getting climate action. So the government of the day will look at the recommendations from the Climate Change Commission. They may decide that they do not wish to implement those, but at least that the citizenry, Australians, can see the outputs of the Climate Change Commission, the actions of the government, and be informed about whether they think that the government of the day is acting consistent with or in the best interests of the nation or themselves. So it gets that transparency that we haven't had before. It's really an important part. Now, the outcomes for this, of course, and I'll pop there in that piece, is better data, connected systems, sound and transparent decision-making, and really importantly, clear accountability. So that's Zali Stegel's sort of framework package. She's also more recently, and I noticed, I think, Tim, you were involved in that as well, proposed 5 steps to net zero. So what else would be implemented? And I've essentially on this slide proposed very consistent her 5 steps, but I've done a little augmentation as well. So step 1, of course, as I mentioned, is from the last part, is passing the bills. But what else we're going to be doing to improve climate action is to transform the energy sector. We've already heard what we need to do. We need to have no new coal and gas projects, no more pulling the fossil fuels out of the ground. I know the old adage that the Stone Age didn't end because we ran out of stones, and the fossil fuel age is not going to end because we ran out of them. It's too dangerous to keep pulling them out of the ground. So we need at least 80% renewables into the delivered energy sector by 2030. And we need some government support for electrifying basically the economy. And particularly also, it makes complete sense that the government steps up and provides those for social, community and public housing, because at the end of the day, the taxpayers paying those bills. So having reliable and cheaper electricity just makes complete sense for those sectors. Second off, we're going to drive clean transport. that's really key that we implement emission standards and fuel standards as well. We want to support, as we heard Gabrielle said, you know, first and foremost, these batteries on wheels are part of the new sort of decentralized and, you know, that's our dispatch sort of model as well for managing the load of this new renewable energy that's going to underpin our very productive, clean and cheaper to produce items economy. But we also do get free transport in the way of electric vehicles. We don't manufacture those in Australia, so we may have missed the boat on that. If we haven't, we've got to get on our horses and get going. And if we do, there's a great role for the government to do a bulk procurement to bring that product to market from a local manufacturing base. On the other hand, because we don't have a manufacturing industry, there's nothing holding us back from bringing in imports for right-hand drive vehicles. And at the moment, though, we do have a number of barriers, financial ones, that sit with the federal government. Admittedly, there are a lot of state and territories that have put in place some incentives and removed those financial barriers to giving us the EVs that we so desperately desire to have. So we just need to get on and bring EVs to market as quickly as possible, at least cost, of course. So modernising industry, diversifying our economic base is really key. I did cut my teeth in energy efficiency, which has got to be one of the more boring but really exciting. Boring because you can't see energy savings. It's not like a lovely big blue PV panel on your roof. You do see it on your energy bill, though, when you save money. But minimum energy performance standards are needed, obviously, for motor vehicles, as I mentioned, but there's motors in almost every single sort of appliance, and we don't have particularly good minimum energy performance standards for the motors where we can have efficiency savings. That can be put across to appliances. Heat pumps don't come with those sorts of minimum requirements, whilst other appliances like TVs do with Energy Star. And of course, that's got to go into our buildings as well. Of course, there's also, we need to capture the industry opportunities. We heard from Tim about steel and aluminium and possibly green hydrogen as well. And super importantly, the role for government, which the private sector just can't do on its own, is we need to transition our communities that are impacted, particularly those that are part of the export industry for our fossil fuels, like in the Hunter, like in the Bowen Basin. We need to help transition those communities because their base will no longer be extraction and export of fossil fuels. I'm going to move a bit quicker. Regenerate Australia and future-proof agriculture. There's a load there, very big passion of mine around restoration of landscapes, just because of the multiple wins that come with that around food and water security, drinking water quality, and just resilience building for times of drought, particularly, and even La Nina episodes of flooding. So riparian zones and rivers revegetating, the biodiversity conservation values that come also with some really clever across landscape plantings for particular species. There's a whole lot of things that we can do on R&D for improving agricultural practices that also help reduce emissions from that sector. There's some areas around investing more in our bioeconomy, making sure that we've got the fibres that can go into our building products, into our clothing. And it goes without saying that ending native forest logging is probably a good idea too. Probably one I don't think Zali has is the use of economic mechanisms. Some of these, yes. Stopping all fossil fuel subsidies is an absolute no-brainer. It just is crazy that we spend taxpayers' money propping up the fossil fuel industry. I am a very big advocate for markets, and a price on carbon is something I would be advocating for. It seems to be what everyone in business is asking for. It's going to give us the least cost solutions at pace to get capital into those assets and enterprises where we can have some of the best greenhouse gas savings and also help pivot our economy onto that clean electric, national secure, because we don't want to keep importing oil, onto that productive base that's going to give us our 21st century economy. There's another element, insurance industry. I don't know if you're seeing it. I'm watching this particularly coming out of the floods in Lismore this time, and the government being the insurer of last resort up in the Northern Territory. We have to have a conversation about the role of insurance in the economy. We can't afford not to have insurance just because of the impact that has right throughout the economy, such as access to debt and borrowing for housing and for shelter. So there are areas of Australia that are just not commercially viable to insure. And that's why we've got the government underwriting climate impacts for buildings in areas of the Northern Territory, because private sector just can't have that kind of risk on their balance sheets. But we do have some, we've turned up and done some things, at least at a state level, around CTP for cars, workers' compensation for employees that are injured at work. There are some solutions that we need to get on our horses to talk that out. And that's also important because when people are impacted by the physical impacts of climate change, they want to be able to repair and restore as quickly as possible. That goes really much to also mental health recovery as well. And without insurance and all that uncertainty that comes with it, we don't support our Australians that are impacted by physical climate risks to the extent we can and should. And then probably this other area around looking out for each other, which is pillar 4 of my principles. Is that time for one of these sort of, no, probably not. We need to support those in our regions that are most affected by the transition, as I mentioned, like Hunter Valley here in New South Wales. But we also need to look at climate resilience for our neighbours, particularly in the Pacific. Now, it's not, there's an opportunity for some technology transfer. If that's when that technology is appropriate and there's support for those communities to actually use that technology appropriately and to have goods and services there that help support it through the lifetime of that technology, including decommissioning it when it's no longer used. But we have to have a conversation about the safe, fair and timely passage to Australia of climate change refugees. And New Zealand's done this for Tuvalu. We need to have that conversation because the processing of refugees is not a particularly high score on Australia's scorecard at the moment. And that's only going to be at a higher volume of people wanting to have refuge and asylum in our country. So essentially, sorry, Ed, implementing each of these is going to give us, I know it sounds overwhelming, but it really is a simple and flexible framework with Zali's bills that's going to improve the decision-making, give us transparency and give the business less uncertainty, double negative chosen on purpose, about where we're going, why, and at what pace in which sectors. That is so important to get this job done at least cost as quickly as possible. And so they're probably the priorities. It might take 2 or 3 terms, but they're the things that once elected, I want to get cracking on. Thank you,
Nicolette. We might jump straight into the Q&A now. I will attempt to do 2 things at once and stop sharing. Has that succeeded? I'll stop sharing. There's a couple of questions in the chat already, and people please do throw your questions in there. To start with, Nick, there was a question that came through from Rob. I think just to paraphrase, a bit concerned about the integrity hit that Zali has taken recently with the misappropriation of donations, and so wants to be certain what you're doing is not just voting for, like, we're not just voting for Zali, we're voting for Nicolette. So if you could just briefly explain what the bits are that are clearly Nicolette stamp, more so than just Zali.
Oh, 2 different things there. If anyone works in the fossil fuel industry and you want to donate to me and you're a person, I will take your money. I will not discriminate against you for being a worker in the fossil fuel sector. But you can't donate to me if you're a company with shareholders' primary purpose is profit. There's a great deal of work that's been done, not just that's been rolled up into these bills that the member for Warringah has put forward. It's not something she's just made up. It's, I mean, Tim, you've been involved in that process. I gave some was an expert witness in one of the committee hearings as well when I was at the Responsible Investment Association Australasia. It is very well considered. It just is. It needs to be adopted and through both houses as soon as possible. What I did in the sort of second load of slides is Zali's group has also done 5 actions. One recommends to implement the set of bills I just mentioned, and those other 4 go to sector-specific things on transport, on industry, on regenerating agriculture. All I've done is built out a few extra pieces like on energy efficiency and heat pumps and elements in there. The structure is pretty much what's needed. I've also added some of the social justice elements onto the end because that's an area that, having worked in human rights, that I feel not only that I feel strongly about, but I know that people in Bradfield care about too, in terms of, for example, discussion around the safe passage of climate change refugees to our country. So I'd be happy to have a go at spelling out which ones are mine and which ones are Zali's, but basically I don't need to reinvent the wheel. There's some great work that's been done on climate policy already. We just need to get on and get it adopted.
Great, thanks, Nick. Tim, I might throw to you. There was a bit of chat through here around Tritium. Now, Tritium have chosen to set up the next large factory. I'm not going to get this right. I think it's in Texas. I think it's somewhere in the US. Why are opportunities like that from a Brisbane-based company being taken offshore rather than being taken up here?
Yeah, as Gabrielle mentioned, I mean, Tritium is very proudly a Brisbane company. It employs, last time I checked, several hundred, like 200 or 300 staff in Brisbane. It is the 95% export oriented, if not more. 99% of its sales were coming from exports because Australia doesn't have much of a fast charging network system in Australia, at least until very, very recently. And so it's an example of how Australian scientific and engineering capacity can be marshaled to solve this global problem, to profit from it, and to develop entirely new businesses of world competitiveness. So sure, to the point you made, President Biden did make a very, very big song and dance about how he'd attracted Tritium to build their first new offshore factory in America, over 500 new jobs in America. President Biden is all about trying to emphasize how the decarbonisation of the American economy will drive new high-value jobs for American workers. So Tritium, it's to me a mark of their success that they are, they've gone from being a Brisbane company startup to a world leader. And so I would say that is a hallmark of success. At the end of the day, Australia is a relatively small domestic market. The population of America is 10+ times that of Australia. The GDP is 15+ times. So the investment opportunity, the end consumer market is 15 times bigger than in Australia. So at the end of the day, the fact that Australia can develop world-leading technology breakthroughs is a huge kudos to us. So I take that as a success. It would be great if we obviously kept more of those jobs onshore, but I'd say that's a mark of success, not a failure.
Great. Thanks, Tim. Nick, I might throw this one to you, and then Tim, I might get you to have a response. Ian Corliss asked, how does the federal budget support both the required energy and economic transition and deal with the rapidly mounting costs of dealing with the escalating climate disasters? Have we left it too late?
Do you mean the budget that's coming tomorrow?
Sure.
I won't be able to answer that till tomorrow. I know I'm going to be. I don't want to answer that in case I'm too cynical. I'm not sure. And even if there is a budget, I'm not even confident that it's going to be well spent, because without a federal ICAC, we just don't know the criteria against which the government's making decisions. And all I'm seeing is just a wealth transfer from the taxpayers to friends' businesses, like we saw with Whitehaven Coal, you know, getting a lovely windfall of money to taxpayers' money to help out the Ukrainians. That is not the principle of helping out the Ukrainians, but the principle of Mark Vaile being the former Nationals leader. And, you know, that anyway, that the point is, I really don't know. It probably just won't be enough is probably the answer you need from me.
Sure, thanks. Tim, did you have anything that you wanted to add there, given some economic style question?
Sorry, I was just responding to Rob's comment. I'll say it publicly. To me, we need massive donation reform in Australia. The fact that Zali was supposedly attacked for failure to disclose, I mean, at the end of the day, they were citizens in her electorate. They donated as a family, individually. It was totally within the law. I'll absolutely agree with Nick. We need donation reform. We need much, much better transparency. And the fact that foreign tax haven-based fossil fuel conglomerates can donate to our two major political parties undermines the integrity of our democracy and is the core reason why we have climate inaction in Australia. So I have hugely strong views about it. I think there was a massive amount of red herring by the Murdoch media, and we need massive media reform as well to maintain and rebuild the integrity of our media so that we can actually have full, frank and fair discourse on what is actually going on. And I think that I mean, maybe I'm probably going a bit too far, but Simon Holmes Court Climate 200 is a direct rip-off of the QUing 200 that Josh Frydenberg has been running. He has zero transparency of the millions and millions of dollars of donations. By that, I'm talking about Josh Frydenberg has zero transparency. And in contrast, Simon Holmes Court has full disclosure totally in compliance with Australian disclosure laws. But at the end of the day, donation reform is absolutely key to my way of thinking, and I think I 100% agree with Nick's position on that.
Great, thank you. And Tim, whilst we've got you there was a bit of back and forth with Eden asking questions around, do you have concerns regarding the carbon credit scheme related to the recent 730 report? Do you mind just giving a bit of background for people that aren't familiar with that scheme or didn't see the 730 report, and then provide your answer?
Yeah, the Australian carbon credit scheme has taken a couple of massive blows in the last month. The international credibility has just been destroyed by one of the key professors who was instrumental in putting the scheme together, has come out and highlighted massive systemic fraud and disclosure issues relating to effectively slush funds for federal government I would argue donors, but anyway, they would argue it was all transparent. The fact that the whole process is now dominated by coal and gas lobbyists are now running the scheme that was set up by the federal bureaucracy to implement scientific schemes to encourage the development of land-based solutions for climate. And it's been massively undermined by jobs for mates and donations. And then Angus Taylor's sort of just come in and rubbed salt in the wounds by destroying the credibility of the scheme by flooding, or by effectively cancelling contracts that have been written by the federal government with counterparties. They've said, no, you feel free, we'll cancel those contracts. You can actually make a multi-billion-dollar windfall gain at the cost to Australian taxpayers. So at the end of the day, I will go back on the positive front that Nicolette mentioned. Australia has huge potential for Australian agriculture to be a world leader in helping solve the climate crisis. Soil sequestration, reforestation, and other agricultural measures are huge opportunities for Australia to dramatically reverse some of the climate impacts, and our farmers should be massively incentivized to actually lead. But that's got to be done with integrity, it's got to be done fairly, with transparency, and it's got to be done so that it's not just deals for mates of federal ministers. Anyway, I'll stop there so I don't get sued for defamation, but
just a reminder, Tim, we are recording tonight's session. There are a couple more questions. We've only got a couple of minutes left. So Nick, there's one that's come through from Suzanne that's looking at the social policy aspects. So in looking out for others, what is your plan for the employment of those people working in the industry? Most of those people probably won't live in this seat, presumably industries that are affected by, as in fossil.
It's a great question. And I think the answer has to be asked to those people in those communities. It has to be co-designed with the support networks of the local government, of state government. And I know that Matt Keane has moved in as well to provide some funding into the Hunter with the Hunter Jobs Alliance, and hub there in Kurri that's looking at how that area will redefine itself in a 21st century economy that doesn't rely on coal exports, which is absolutely essential, but it has to come from the community for themselves. They have to self-determinate with that. So I can give you what I think, but it's not going to be relevant to what those people in the Hunter actually want and need to do.
Right. And there are a couple of questions that I'm really conscious of time. I'll just go with one last one from Anthony. There's ongoing discussion of all the elements of this. How can we get the next government to accelerate action without replaying all of the arguments again? Will the next government be encouraged by the Australian community, or will it be cautious? Nicolette, I'll turn to you for that one.
Sorry, my internet blocked and I missed you.
There's ongoing discussion on the elements of all of this. How can we get the next government to accelerate action without replaying all the arguments? Will the next government be encouraged by the Australian community, or will it be cautious?
Oh, that's a Dorothy Dixon for vote community independence, obviously. We do need to break that deadlock. The parties just haven't managed to get it done. So the answer is yes. If we have true representation, if the people in Bradfield, for example, truly want climate action, they need to go to the polls and vote for that representative who they think can do that the best. That's all I can give you. And then hopefully enough of those electorates around Australia do the same, and we get to move legislation through and get cracking on it.
Right. And Tim and Gabrielle, I might just quickly ask whether either of you knows the answer to Helen Mannix's question regarding judicial decision in relation to noise from wind turbines at night. Is that going to have an impact on the industry? Are either of you informed in that space?
I'm not up to speed on that. I saw that particular decision. I'm not up to speed on what the industry is saying about whether that will have significant impacts. Obviously, a lot of wind farms are well away from people's homes, so that's not really a major issue. And one of the, I think where the obvious place to go with any concerns about wind turbines near where people live is where the Victorian government's gone, which is setting a target for offshore wind. When people first started talking about offshore wind turbines, I was like, this can't possibly ever be economic. You're sticking a huge hunk of steel, a few hundred meters high off the coast, and you've got to get the electricity back on shore. And how can that possibly ever make money? It's going to be so expensive. But amazingly enough, particularly because the English and the Scots got into it, like all of these things, the technology came down the cost curve. And now because you get more consistent wind offshore, you can make money building wind turbines offshore. So that's something that New South Wales hasn't looked at in great detail yet, but hopefully is another future direction to help us get to faster decarbonisation as well.
Excellent. Thank you, Gabrielle. So everyone, thank you very much for your time this evening. There were quite a few questions come through. If there's follow-up questions that you did have, please do email them through to us and we'll endeavour to respond. In terms of what else is coming up for the campaign, obviously vote one Buller. I can't run this without starting with that. And secondly, spread the word. If you know people who care about climate action, then tell them about Nick and what she stands for. This month we're aiming for 1,000 donations of $100. So if you haven't had the chance to donate, please do jump in and do so. And finally, next Tuesday we'll be running a similar event, another view at Nicoleettes Positions on the topics that matter in Bradfield, and next week's is on the modern economy, a week post tomorrow's budget that may or may not ever be. So thank you very much for your time all, and look forward to seeing you at the next one.
Thank you.